Hello and welcome to the Echo Chamber podcast. My name is Tony Groves, and folks, back talking to a listener favourite and someone who has been educating me and thereby, I suppose, educating some of our listeners. But many of you are more au fait in the way of Marxism than you let on. But look, this will be a bit of a different podcast with Dr. Brian O'Boyle. He's the author of Tax Haven Ireland. He's the editor of the Irish Marxist Review, and he's written a fascinating article about the US-Israeli war, illegal war on Iran, and what it means. That's available now. There's a link at the bottom of the pod, just where you see the donation button for Dignity for Palestine. There will be a link to Brian's article. I suggest you read it. Maybe even hit pause, read that, and then come back and listen to this full podcast. But nonetheless, Brian, it's great to see you, and thanks for doing this.
Thanks very much. It's nice to be here, Tony.
We were talking about doing podcasts in the next few months about the function of the market and how we could kind of talk about how it's operating and how it doesn't operate, and then geopolitics, as it often does, rears its ugly head. So if you don't mind, we'll go to what you've written now. Again, link at the bottom, in relation to what's happened and the what seems like the Tangerine Idi Amin's insane idea of invading Iran. But when you really step back from it, as you have, there are other forces at play. So maybe give us a broad spectrum idea of what you're saying is happening here.
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing to say is, like, it's always a complex, over-determined picture, isn't it? So there's all sorts of things can be happening. So someone might say to you on the street, sure, is this not just about a bit of good intelligence? They find out where the supreme leader is and they think, well, let's take him out. We've had 40 years of this and we want to get rid of him. And, maybe it's about narrow electoral gain. And, some people, slightly more conspiratorial views would say that when you're in a wartime situation, authoritarian leaders thrive because they can drive home, that sort of authoritarianism at home. And all that stuff could be true. But what I tried to do in the piece is just to say, well, actually, this is a very risky strategy for the Americans in particular. Not so much for the Israelis, but certainly for the Americans. So it demands a sense in which it's a little bit more than just a knee-jerk reaction or an impulse of a narcissist. I think there's more going on, right? So what I tried to do is unpack the strategy in three main arguments. And the first one is that Iran was and could again be, as far as they're concerned, a really important asset for American imperialism. So if you go back to the 1970s, America would have judged Arab nationalism, the Nassers of Egypt, the Mossadegh in Iran, as the primary destabilizing influence of them controlling, at that time and even now, one of the world's most important geostrategic sites of operation, right? So at that time, Iran was actually a really strong proxy of America. And they faced more challenge from the likes of Lebanon, Syria, and Egypt. And there was wars against Israel that would tell that story. In the mid-70s, they sort of tamed Arab nationalism after the Yom Kippur War. And for a brief moment, they felt that they had all of the key proxy states under the American influence. Those three most important ones being four probably: Egypt, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. And then there's a revolution. And the revolution is sort of very chaotic. It's in 1979, 1 year after the Camp David Accords, which had sort of brought the Egyptians under the American influence. And it kind of destabilized their whole picture of the Middle East again. And as I say in the piece, it sort of led to four setbacks for American imperialism. The first one is the obvious one, which is that it sort of changed the balance of geostrategic power in the region. The second one is that the Americans had sort of devised a strategy of a widespread security strategy. It was going to hinge on two key pillars, one being Iran, and that was pulled from under them. The obvious thing then about sort of radical Islam, that's their term, obviously, rather than ours, that this was a sort of a rallying call for a new foe for American imperialism, not Arab nationalism, but radical Islam. And the fourth thing is the oil, the fact that Iran had so much oil at the time. One of the reasons why the Iranians has suffered an internal coup led by the CIA was precisely because Iran had so much oil. So it's always been that mix of oil
led by the
and
CIA and companies like BP of all these,
yes,
like, I mean, it was
exactly.
it was blatant. Like, history didn't start when the theocracy came to power,
Absolutely, absolutely.
but I suppose one of the things that you're pointing out, which is important, is that Iran has been in the Western world has been sidelined as this sort of, as if it doesn't count, as if it has no um, geopolitical power,
Mm,
or it's not structurally important. But that's not true. And if you look at, like we've spoken to Konstantin Gurdjieff on this podcast several times about the fact that with the sanctions that took place on Russia following Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine, they sped up the process of the BRICS. They sped it up, like so Brazil, Russia, India, China, these countries. Iran is a member, boys and girls, and in that group, including at the time Venezuela, if you added them up, they had more access to the world's oil reserves than our hegemony does.
mm.
On our side, I say. And that is something that America couldn't actually tolerate. You can talk about, as Brian said, is Trump mad? Yes. Are there Christian evangelists who want to do this? Yes. Is Israel mowing the lawn and taking territory? Yes. But there's a bigger game at play here, Brian, and it's a lot of it comes down to this kind of, how a lot of the fulcrum could actually pivot on Iran.
Yeah, exactly. And and the world system is one where the major imperialist powers, they sort of they carve spheres out of operations and they rank them in terms of importance. And then they think about, what would we like to achieve in a region and who else would like to be achieving things in that region, and how do we exercise our power both to maximize our own influence and importantly to minimize other players' influences. So for example, the Americans would see that in terms of fossil fuels, they are by far the most insulated of the big imperialist players. If you call the EU one, you call China another. It's clear that in terms of the direct impact of this, America is less impacted, right? It also is clear that the Americans have basically always sort of dragooned the Europeans in behind them, so that, like, in the end, America's military strength is really important for ensuring that Europe's economic access to oil is protected. But there's a flip to that, which is to say the Americans can dominate Europe via the fact that they control access to Middle Eastern oil, right? But then there's the question of China. China has been sort of the main strategy the Americans deployed since about 2005 is containment of China. And the way they do that is through three things. They outspend them militarily. They look for key Southeast Asian alternative sites of accumulation of capitalism, South Korea, Japan being the two probably most important ones. And then they have these islands, the Philippines, Indonesia even, where they sort of say, well, we're going to hem the Chinese in the South China Sea, knowing that Chinese capitalism relies absolutely on exports. We know this year was the first year that China had a $1 trillion export surplus, right? So the Chinese have tried to pivot away from the fact of needing to always use the South China Sea. And increasingly, as I say in the article, they've looked to the likes of the Middle East as a sort of an entry point for a sea route into Europe. And so they've got this thing that your listeners will be aware of, the Belt and Road Initiative, which is, like, by all accounts, a $4 trillion investment in infrastructure program to build rail and, well, actually, I mean, initially it's to build rail and road, right? So the Belt and Road, but at the same time, it's about building influence and access right through Asia for Chinese capitalism at the expense of others. And it comes out, a lot of it, in Iran. So the Iranian part of the Belt and Road was worth $400 billion. And there was a grand comprehensive agreement signed in 2021, which was worth 400 billion, as I said. It was all to do with, like, port access and making sure that Iran, was boxed off as a major supplier of oil into China. So obviously, if I know this, I'm just one fella. The US State Department knows this. I mean, Trump, for all his madness, understands all of these bigger geopolitical strategies. And to my mind, it'd be naive to think that there's just a sort of an impulsive, let's destabilize Iran because there are enemies. This is the kind of that's the propaganda fluff on the top of a really much more hard-nosed strategy of trying to basically get imperial leverage over the Chinese
Look,
inside
I
the
want to push in
Chinese.
and just say, because a lot of this is actually, a lot of it is explicit in things like Project 2025, with the likes of Russ Vaught and these guys who come up with it, not Trump, the guys who are behind the scenes who put Stephen Miller in there to tell them how to start implementing it. And they've been talking about for decades that, China is the enemy. As you say, we need to hem them in, but not just, we have to dominate them. And they knew full well that, the saying goes that if the Americans arrive into a struggling country, it may bring some aid. China builds hospitals, and this was as you pointed out, the investment into Iran wasn't a 1-year deal. It wasn't. It was just a strategic deal that was going to see them benefit, China benefit in the long run, and it also then tips this. Going back to what I was trying to say earlier about Ukraine, when you decide to hem off the Russians, you also then say, well, actually, we can't trust America not to do this to us. Therefore, we need to develop alternatives. And the minute you start developing or the minute you create the alternative to, like, say, the banking SWIFT system, or how do they pay for? Because you used to have to pay for oil and gas in petrodollar, in the dollar. If you start finding other ways to do it, you're already undermining the hegemon that is set out to say, if you do that, we're going to punish you further. But you've created it that so it's like an Ouroboros of US capitalism eating itself. And this is the bigger picture. And guys above Trump, and I say that, I know they don't hold office, but I mean, the guys who write the things, they see it, they understand what's happening here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you've said a lot of important things there that we probably unpack here, right? So if we go to the SWIFT system, for example, right? I was on the streets on Saturday in Sligo, where I live, and I was doing a stall on the Occupied Territories Bill, which we do every Saturday. And an Iranian woman came up, and fair enough, said, well, why aren't you protesting for Iran? And we got into a bit of a conversation. And she kind of, in desperation was saying, I don't really trust the Americans, but on balance, the regime is so repressive, has done, so much damage to Iranian society that I'm sort of willing to give them a shot, kind of thing. And, why would you not see that, like, for us, it's better to have the American imperialist than it is to have the theocracy, And I, look, I understand, like, if you're living with someone and they have their foot on your neck and someone else punches the guy with the foot on your neck, you're going to think, well, why are you not happy that your man got punched, But the truth is that the one of the main reasons why life has got so hard for Iranian people is precisely what you said, which is that the Americans control the international payments system. And through that control, they can effectively have one-way sanctions that start to really hollow out financial systems in a country, their exporting capacity. I mean, the oil revenues have fallen, I think it's by about 45, 50%. And the only reason they haven't fully fallen is because the Chinese broke the international sanctions. I mean, if the sanctions had been watertight, the Iranian economy would have collapsed earlier. And so what you're seeing is ordinary people's. I'm no friend of the theocracy or of the supreme leader or the Revolutionary Guard. So let's just get that clear. Like, I am absolutely with the people revolting against them. But let's also be honest. One of the drivers of the revolution against them is the fact that the whole economy has been squeezed, and it's not that the Revolutionary Guards are so well insulated that they won't feel it in their daily lives. It will be ordinary Iranian men and women and children who will be squeezed, who will be pushed into poverty. And so the American control of the dollar and through the payment system is an extremely important, powerful tool for destabilizing countries internally. Now, would we want to see the internal destabilization of the regime? Yes, but from below, because we know what happens from above.
If we'd seen it organically, if you understand if we'd seen it, like, 100%. Because like, again, people forget the high levels of educational attainment in for females in Iran in terms of higher professions, in terms of medicine and and the sciences. Because it is a theocracy, many of the men are trained in religious studies, and I'm sorry, lads, but you've very little economic benefit to us, But when it comes to these sort of things, you would love to see that was the reason it turned on its head. But we are both expressing concerns that the American idea of this is not actually with woman, life, freedom. It's actually let's put back in a monarch who we can control, and they're being clear about this. They're
Yeah, no,
they're they're
absolutely.
they're hosting the guy at dinner parties and bringing him around, and it's so let's tell the truth. And so yeah, but back to then the idea of sort of there's this we're all agitating now. What are we going to do? The price of petrol's gone up. We're all having to pay more. Price of electricity's gone up, but we're sort of unable to actually see the wider principles of why America really needs to tip the balance back, Brian.
Yeah. So look, I mean, people know that on October 7th, right? The Western narrative is always sort of bloodlust, brown people who are irrational, can't be trusted. Part of a sort of a deep racist narrative that makes you sort of is designed to say, school gets bombed in the West, it will be in the news for a year. School gets bombed or a hospital gets bombed in Iran. Yeah, let's move on. Mistake, whatever. Trump just washes it off as if it was nothing, right? So the thing is that that's the kind of strategy whereby you dehumanize the enemy, right? So the argument was that Hamas had no strategy. Now, I wrote at the time that what Hamas were trying to do was blow up the Abraham Accords, which, the Trump project has been about sort of saying, how do we solve the Palestine question in a new way? Up until the Trumpists, the main idea was let's keep calling for a two-state solution, knowing that on the ground, the Israelis will make the two-state solution impossible, but we will use it as a diplomatic cover. Every time there's a blow-up, we say we must get back to the two-state solution. And that gives us the time to allow the Israelis to actually bury the Palestinians, slowly but surely, quietly squeezing them out. But that was what was going on. And the Trump sort of Kushner axis, basically, because they're, transactional in the sense of commerce, and because they have so many Middle Eastern deals with like big, with all the various monarchs in the region, they could see that one way to bury this question was to do the following. But basically to get a sort of a European Union style integration, right? So what they were planning was that the Middle East would become more economically integrated around a single market. But the key drivers of that market would be twofold. On the one hand, you would have the high-tech Israeli, defense industry, the biotech industry, the software industry, really linked into American capitalism. And on the other hand, you'd have all the vast oil revenues of the monarchies would be driven into the Israeli industry. And so it would make them sort of symbiotic. It would make them interdependent. And so effectively, you would normalize Israel's presence in the region economically as opposed to diplomatically. Now, the key sort of state in all of that in the calculation is Saudi Arabia, okay? And the Hamas got very good advice or good intel that in the weeks leading up to October, there was possibly at least going to be a deal between the Saudis and the Israelis to start this process of normalization, which would lead to this big capital accumulation that the Americans would benefit from. And it was in that context that October 7th happened, among other things, obviously, but that's one of the contexts. So the Trumpists now and Netanyahu and so on, what they can see is what we want to try and do now is revive the Abraham Accords by smashing all of the opposition in the region and making sure that Western investors in particular think that this region is going to be safe for us. And so part of this project is about making, as you say, I mean, their ideal strategy and so, Gideon Rachman in the Financial Times makes the argument, I don't know what you think of this argument, that like Trump's hubris was partly driven by how successful they were in Venezuela, that they threw up this Delcy Rodriguez almost organically, and obviously they had a few months of negotiation, but he was sure that what they could do would be very similar in Iran, where, because what you're offering is a seat at the top table, and we're going to take away the sanctions, and we're going to let you have some capital accumulation. He thought that there would be organically a layer of people below the supreme leader who would step up and say, we will deal with the Americans. But then he has said in some sort of
Like
hubristic way, we blew them all up, we
I
killed
think
them all.
I think he was also misled by the Israeli intentions from the outset as
Yeah,
well.
that's a good point.
They were very clear on they wanted to smash not just one or two layers. They've been doing this in Palestine for years, where they mowed the lawn.
Exactly. Yeah, no, you're right. There's a divergence, isn't there,
yeah,
between
and
the two? Slight divergence, yeah.
because we know Netanyahu visited Trump only a couple of weeks before this most recent escalation, but you can't look at that war as in this war just started now without saying it actually began already last September when they obliterated the nuclear program. So that was
right.
It's just a continuation of the same thing. But what's scary, I suppose, is when you talk about the idea of bringing the Emiratis, the Saudis, and all of these petro states, for want of a better term, into the world. What has happened? It has happened. It has taken place. But now they're looking around. Only this morning I wake up and see Irish people saying, meant to wake up in Dubai, but the planes turned around. And because Dubai International Airport is on fire again. And some of them are now looking around going, well, you told us if we did the deals with you guys would protect us. But it turns out, you can't protect anything currently. You've overextended the THAAD missile defense that you don't even have enough to carry out for the rest of the year. Iran very successfully took out two of their, the radar machinery. Excuse me, I'm not a military brain, but you know what I'm trying to say, folks. And they've caused countless billions of dollars worth of damage. And the other issue here is this, where it gets complicated for the sort of, when Trump made his inauguration speech and he stood there, you may remember, Brian, who was standing directly behind him, all the tech bros, the richest men in the world.
Yeah.
Most of those tech bros, you're quite right, a lot of their financing comes from Saudi and right, the Qatars, and that's, there's pressure coming on there saying, to the likes of Larry Ellison, who wants to buy all of the media, well, by the way, you've to put together 14 billion, of which you're only putting in 4 billion. Where are you getting the other 10? You're relying on us for this. So what the hell, guys? Why would we give you the extra 10 if our ports are on fire and you're not and we can't actually ship out the oil? Because if you stop shipping oil, it doesn't, it doesn't age like wine. It doesn't get better with age, and these, so they're facing all of these, do I think Trump really cares enough? Probably not, but the people around him will, is what I'm trying to say.
Okay, well, let's do that in two parts then, if you don't mind, right? So the first point you made is about the sort of motivation. And again, I am kind of minded, or I'm sort of convinced to some extent, that the Delcy Rodriguez model might have been what he thought he was going to get.
Well, he absolutely thinks of it because he believes American military power is such that they will just say, oh no, look, all we're going to do is shit our pants and hand it over to you. That's what they think.
And that would have been the cleanest way, because obviously what that for him would have been was, it's a cost benefit, right? So we have relatively low level of cost. Very few American lives. We shock and awe them. Somebody emerges. We deal with them, and we get what we want. We don't pretend we want democracy. We don't care about, human rights. We don't care about what happens internally. We just want to deal with somebody who'll give us the oil, not the Chinese. And for them, at the moment, 90% of Iranian oil, Iran has the third largest oil reserves in the world, and 90% of it goes to China. So even that calculation, if you could have got a sort of a Delcy Rodriguez puppet regime in, would have been good. The problem they have is obviously, the Iranian regime has decentralized its leadership because it's not stupid and it's reflexive, and it understands that, it's very likely you're going to try and take out the senior leadership.
It's had 50 years to plan for this, Brian.
Exactly. And I wonder then, is America's view, I feel the Americans, I think this brings me to the second point you just made, I think they want to extricate themselves now, right? Because I think there's a danger for them in a kind of a collapse. Now, let's be very clear, right? Donald Trump does not care about ordinary people in Iran. When there was hundreds of thousands or millions of people on the streets, they did not do anything to aid them. They actually left them to suffer on the basis of, we will then have an alibi to go in ourselves from above. They're not interested in helping anybody from below. And the truth, and you just said it, there's regimes in the region, the UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, who have worse human rights abuses. And Trump, remember Khashoggi, the whole thing about Khashoggi? Sure, this collateral damage, human beings being murdered is part of the game here. So the idea that there's any, moral or, high-minded view is basically, we all know this, that there isn't one, right? But do they want a kind of a collapse of the whole state? I think the Israelis are happy enough to do that because they think it will destroy our primary enemy in the world. But the Americans would have to think twice about that, because would you want a collapsed state on the borders of your wonderful economic miracle? You definitely wouldn't.
I want to push in because that's one of the fallacies that people need to stop going on about. I know everybody says, oh, well, Netanyahu tells Trump what to do and Israel directs things. Ultimately, the hegemon is America, right? Boys and girls, let's cut the bullshit. They just often put a Israeli sticking plaster over their plans anyway, or wrapping paper on it to make it look like that it's been done. It's not. It's been done in their interests, and Israel just is actually convenient for them. Whether or not Trump gets the one over on Netanyahu in their one-to-ones, I couldn't give a fuck, and neither should any of you. But we need to stop. We need to stop saying that this is what American appeasement of Israel looks like. It's not. But there is now a divergence in what they both want. Israel would be happy enough to see balkanization of Iran. They'd be happy enough to see it go the way of Syria, whereby it became chaos, where they could actually extend the greater Israel project and start working in ways where they could see other things fall apart. Whereas America, as you know, they're looking, how do we push back China? And we need to push back China, not tomorrow, but for the next 20 years, 30 years, because China's not going anywhere.
Well, exactly. And the national security plan that sort of said we're just going to focus on the Western Hemisphere. I think we argued at the time that was a sort of a partial, very, very partial picture, which was about buying time, right? So what your sort of listeners need to understand is that the Americans have a China problem because they don't really know how to take the Chinese on for two reasons. First of all, the Chinese have been very successful. You said about the soft diplomacy that they do, right? So what China has tried to do is don't provoke the more powerful player, softly catch a monkey and appeal to other rulers and their interests. So build infrastructure, develop expertise, create partnerships, soft diplomacy, slowly but slowly create a multipolar world in which we have a lot of strategic importance. And that's the kind of model they've pursued. And the Americans find it hard to take that on because historically, empires were aggressive, they were upfront, they were challenging for each other's land resources, and it led to hot wars. A hot war at the moment, America would be fairly confident of winning, albeit that nuclear weapons we can leave out. But in terms of just conventional combat, but the problem, of course, is that would blow up the whole economy now in the global system. And a lot of America's power over the last 25 years has come from its ability to pivot into Asia and exploit vast numbers, hundreds of millions of workers in Asia. And China is a big part of that picture, the global supply chains and all that kind of stuff. And so, they have this challenge whereby China have been very strategically good at sort of growing, bit by bit, gradually. And then what China has done, they've gotten these ideas of choke points where they find parts of capitalism that they can kind of monopolize. And one of those is rare earth minerals, which have become increasingly important because they're essential to artificial intelligence technologies. And so, Trump came in a big sort of song and a dance about, I'm going to smash China. There's going to be 145% tariffs. And the Chinese said, okay, well, we'll just match you with your tariffs, knowing that they had this in the background. And then when Trump tried to make NVIDIA, which is the world's biggest chip maker, only sell second-rate chips to Chinese customers, the Chinese says, okay, well, if you want to play that game, we're going to shut off all the rare earth minerals. The Americans backed down. It was probably the first time in a while that they've actually had to really back down in a kind of a conflict of that sort of level of magnitude. And it showed that China now has a lot of leverage.
China pulled a few levers. Okay, so China pulled the lever of just the soybean market. They went, watch, we're gonna pivot to someone else. Trump went, oh shit. China turned around and said, we're gonna go just even to piss you off. We're going to nearshore stuff with the Mexicans and the Canadians. There was another one that caused, that showed that they could do it. And as you quite rightly point out, when you have NVIDIA with Jensen Huang running in and out of the White House saying we need to be able to sell them these top of the range NVIDIA chips, and Trump backing down. And albeit it was already happening, just to be very clear, they were already allowing them to be sold to people in the Emirates who were then selling them to the Chinese. But nonetheless, the point stands. China did that without pointing a gun at anyone. Whereas, the as you said, the American idea is might makes right, and they've been very clear about that over the last few months. The international law be damned. Not that we're saying China are a great bastion of international law, but what we need to point out, and I think it's what Brian is getting at, and I'd like you to talk a little bit about this, is the success of Chinese capitalism, of how it's flipped that, and America can't get their head around it because they can't make capitalism work as well as they want to.
Yeah, I mean, so if you want me to do that one first, can I just tell you one other thing, just in case we don't get back to it, right? I want your listeners to go on to the White House website, because the sums of money that are involved in those Abraham Accords are just mind-boggling, right? So if you look, it says on the website, obviously Trump is prone to hyperbole and so on, so you can, I can't verify it, but it says that the sums of money are that the Saudis have pledged 600 billion. Qatar, I think it's 1.2 trillion, and the UAE 1.4 trillion, something like this.
Right? You're exactly right. Yeah,
I mean, this is absolutely staggering levels of investment intentions, right? And if that did come off, like back in the sort of post-war period, it's kind of interesting, isn't it? People will know that like Germany and Japan lose World War II, and yet by the 1980s, it's Germany and Japan that are the number 2 and 3 economies in the world after America. People might say, well, how did they manage to do that? And they did that primarily because America saw advantage in rebuilding 2 defeated enemies to fight the new enemy, which was the Soviet Union. So that what happens is you find a sort of a center of capitalism, a center of capital accumulation, and you build an integrated market around that, and then you fill it up with your corporations. And what they're trying to do, what they did in Germany through the economic union, they're trying to do that in the Middle East now, because what they think is the Israelis have shifted the dial in terms of their military power. They're extremely aggressive. As you said, this greater Israel strategy is really destabilizing. And if you lived in the Middle East, you'd be terrified, I think, of the constant aggression of the Israeli state. But the flip of that is Israel's never been more hated in the world. It's hated in the international community. It's hated by most ordinary people. And so their gamble is, let's not appeal to niceties or to international law or to the UN. Let's do hard-nosed business that resuscitates the Israeli regime via successful capitalism. That's the goal, right? That's what they're trying to drive. And I think it's important to see that they were hoping that this would be a short, sharp shock, get rid of the regime and find a proxy, get them in there, and then get the investment flowing to rehabilitate the Israelis in order for America, as you said yourself, to dominate the region. They're not backing the Israelis because they like the Israelis. They're backing the Israelis because the Israelis are their instrument in the Middle East. That's why they back the Israelis. I mean, of course, Israel has a powerful lobby, and of course, there's lots of, trade links and so on. But in the end, it's about an imperialist proxy in that region that does the bidding of America. And no other working class in the region has any respect for America. The Saudi regime may well support the Americans, but this average Saudi person, I doubt, has very much love for America. Similarly in Egypt, similarly in the various autocracies and monarchies. So what marks the Israelis out is that it's a state of 10 million people that the Americans can absolutely rely on. And it has shown its teeth over and over again. And so that's why it's so important to them, not because they like Netanyahu or whatever. So that's the point, isn't it? That they're playing for big stakes here. But your second point...
I want to come to the second point in a moment. I just want to say something for listeners again. I did a podcast, I think it was Patreon only, a few months ago, about the think tank in North America that goes out and says, what are global attitudes like to world powers? And the biggest swing from favourable to unfavourable has been in the US. They're now just a couple of... They're actually trusted less than Russia. But at the bottom of the bottom 3 countries are, Brian, can you name the bottom 3 least favourable countries? Have a go.
Who have least...
So we've asked 47 countries. which countries do you think are more dangerous for your prosperity, your country's prosperity? The bottom three
And
are.
is it OECD Western countries or across the
No,
board?
it includes, well, yeah, it was Latin America, South America, Asia, and EU. So they were all like, it's a North American think tank that operates in both Washington and in Vancouver. And it was really simple, which was funny. Iran was marginally ahead of Israel, who were just above America at this stage. And they didn't get the results they thought they were going to get. You know, it was like,
Yeah, no,
wow.
absolutely, absolutely, yeah. And so, yeah, so your point, like, so I think we've given listeners a good enough sense of the stakes they're playing for. I think we've also underlined, but I think it's important to do, that they had a strategy of a quick, short, sharp shock sort of a thing, and now they're getting bogged down. This was your point that I didn't respond to, but I should. That, like, the Iranians have a strategy, right? And the strategy is one that is quite dangerous, because I think they've sort of got like this command structure of maybe 30 or 40 sort of, levels of leadership, not 30 or 40, I mean, horizontal, different centers of leadership, let's say. And the idea being, if I cut the head off one, the other one emerges, and they've all got this idea that they fight and fight and fight to protect the regime. And you could imagine, if that kind of collapsed in on itself, that's a real recipe for warlordism like we got in Iran, or in Iraq. Now, the Americans will know this, and they don't actually care that the lives of millions and millions of ordinary people could be, pushed into absolute barbarity and chaos. But leaving that aside, the regime as it stands has a strategy, and it's called, what this guy called Robert Page, and he calls it I think it's called horizontal escalation. It's a kind of buzzword. What it means is kind of, in terms of leverage, you can bring all your full force on top of us, and you're doing that with your military, with your American military. But you have to protect the whole infrastructure of global capitalism as well at the same time. And all we have to do is survive. He gives this point about saying we don't have to defeat the American military, we just have to defeat the American treasury markets. What does that mean? Well, over the last 14 months, the times when Trump has had to sort of take a backward step and sort of, retreat, have always been to do with when global money markets start to sell dollars. The reason for that, as we said earlier on, is that the dollar dominance of America, it really is probably actually its most strategically important weapon, more even than the American military. I would say that their dominance of global finance. Because think about how finance knits the whole system together. So if you control the currency, you control the main investment banks, you can control the main payment system, you get enormous leverage over all the other capitalist states, right? So the Americans, despite whinging on about how badly they've been treated in capitalism, the truth is that they've dominated capitalism. They've had disproportionate benefits from the system, and they mostly come from finance. Now, the other thing they want to protect is oil. So what the rebels are doing, and what the Iranians are doing, and what the proxies are doing, is basically saying, well, let's fire drones in, pot shots. Let's just take pot shots into the Strait of Hormuz, knowing that no insurance company will give any oil tankers the insurance to drive through.
You won't be allowed pass. It's simple as that.
You won't be allowed pass, exactly. And that is basically sending oil prices up, right? So let's follow the logic, the kind of sequence of causes. The oil price is rising. We all know that from the pumps, even though there's gouging happening as usual. The price is usually, as you know, has been hedged for a while. So they don't need to put their price up yet, but they're gouging us. But let's assume oil prices on international markets have gone up. That's true. That drives inflation because oil is so important to global capitalism. Rising prices, right, have an inverse relationship with bond prices. That's the thing, right? So when the prices go up, interest rates go up, and when interest rates go up to kind of bring down the inflation, the price of bonds goes down.
There's already been mood music out of the ECB about two interest rates in the next couple of quarters,
exactly,
which is terrifying. Like, people should be realizing this is bad news.
If that happens, and there's a big crisis in the global economy because of this kind of twin shock of oil crisis and then money market crisis, that's when they think Trump will blink. So they have no faith in Trump, the humanitarian. They have some sense that Trump is the hard-nosed capitalist who will blink if they can outlast them. So it's like a kind of a tolerance of pain question. You can destroy our infrastructure, you can bomb us, but you will not put even one soldier on the ground because you can't tolerate any pain. we can tolerate, you can inflict a lot of pain, but we can tolerate a lot more pain. And it's a question of, will the Americans be able to inflict enough pain that the regime sort of collapses inwardly, or will the regime be able to outlast them for a while till the global economy goes into crisis and Trump has to stop? That's the kind of the dynamic
Yeah,
at the moment.
like, I mean, there's the reports, if anybody's been following them, of these aquatic drones that are just sitting there in floating about in the Straits of Hormuz. Very hard to see because most of it's below the surface. They have solar panels on top of them, so they don't even need batteries. They're charging as they go, and the chances are that if you want to sail by, they only have to use a remote control to pop into you, and like that is terrifying for anybody who's operating in a strait that sees 20% of the world's oil move up and down. Like that's just
100%.
so.
And there's another interesting fact there, right? That's all absolutely true. And I read about it yesterday where they're saying, a Patriot missile is like something like, is it $3 million?
Yeah.
They fire one, and they're firing $3 million rockets to hit things that are worth 25 grand. Some of them are styrofoam. This is because as you said, they're slow enough that the radar can't pick them up. So it's almost like they're so low tech that America's extremely high tech defenses can't actually cope with them sometimes. But if you think of it this way as well, the other thing that the sort of Emiratis have, right? What have they got? They've got oil, they've got slaves, and they've got rich millionaires and influencers and people who want to come on holiday. That's basically the economy, right? So that's the situation. And you can imagine, I saw this woman, Isabel Oakeshott, who's like some British tough influencer.
Well, she was more, I hate, I love Britain, and that's why I must leave Britain.
Yeah, because I can't pay tax in Britain because I love it so much. I'm a patriot. I'm such a patriot that my husband is trying to, we've moved offshore for tax reasons. Anyway, the point is that people like that, are sending back saying, "Oh, well, we will be fine." But you can be guaranteed, like, that they're being funded by the regimes who are terrified now that their little oasis of stability in global capitalism is under pressure. Because who wants to go on holidays when the bombs could be falling all around you in your swimming pool? I mean, nobody wants to be involved in that kind of instability. So the whole regional economy is also now being upended because the Trump, quick surgical strike didn't happen. Now it's leading into a kind of a global conflict. And as I said, the Iranians are gambling. They can take more pain, and their pain threshold is much higher than the rest of the region. Who knows? You'd be mad to say which way it will go. But
well, we can look at history. Yeah. We can look at history, and we can say when Saddam was America's ally, they backed him to the hilt with whatever he wanted, including weapons of mass destruction, boys and girls, including chemical weapons like mustard gas and the rights. And he carried out a 2-week war, the Whirlwind War. It was going to take a couple of weeks to smash Iran back and take all of these assets. And 8 years later, he retreated with his tail tucked between his legs. So we can learn from history about Iran. It's a country of 92 million people. No one wants. I abhor death. I abhor war. I abhor what's happening. But don't tell me for a moment that that the American, the idea is 13 American troops so far, we know, have been killed. That's the official. Yeah, it's 13 now. There's over 30 receiving treatment for critical. A lot of people have been injured, especially in the initial strike where 6 people died. That there was a lot more people injured in that initial one, and now and then America's telling. This is where it gets into the fog of war, where America's saying, "Oh, the next 7 people was due to an accident in a refilling thing," and you're going, "Well, you can't believe them anyway." So it's just, and you have the Iranians coming and say, no, we did it. One of our proxies did it, and so it's all horrible.
Yeah, I mean, it is easy when you're doing all this sort of global analysis to forget like that. I have 2 children, like 2 girls. I'm like, a girls' school gets blown up, and Trump blase says, "Oh, they probably did that themselves. They fired one of our American Patriot missiles at their own school, our hospital, school. And it's like,
well, look, I tell you what makes me sick, Brian, is the idea that we've spent 40 minutes, and we're not special, but we all spend this time talking about how the pressure will be put upon him because Americans will have to pay too much for gas at the pumps, as they say. and there's no fucking pressure coming internally because of the slaughter of 160 young children. That's what tells you where, there is, and not only is there a support for, like, if you flipped Trump out in the morning, I don't think things would change right now, because even the Republicans are saying, well, we're in it now. We have to. Jake Tapper asked I think it was Hakeem Jeffries about funding this war, signing off on an additional 50 billion. And it was like, and if you don't, you won't, and I quote, you might be seen to not support the troops. If you want to support the troops, bring them home.
And I mean, yeah, and so let's underline the brutality of all of these sides. I mean, the regime, what are the estimates? 7,000 of its own citizens were murdered, slaughtered in the streets looking for, I mean, and this idea that it's all proxies and all, I don't buy that, because, first of all, I'm humble enough not to know exactly the dynamic of what's going on the ground, but there's been multiple waves of protest in Iran, and they stack up with the idea of a society, as you say, that's complex, that's well educated. People who are well educated generally try to fight for higher forms of economic and social rights. And then you have this narrowing, regime that probably has the popular support of 15 or 20%. And what keeps them in situ is that relatively narrow popular base, but also their willingness to murder their own people. So let's not pretend that the regime is anything we should be worried about protecting. But you go back and look at what the Lancet reported. The Lancet's one of the world's most prestigious journals. They estimated back in the early 2000s in the mid 2000s, that the death toll from the wider conflagration started, as you said, by the Americans in 2003 was around 1 million people. Like, this is like 1 million lives. There was a guy yesterday I was listening to said that the conservative estimate of American sanctions on the global south is 38 million people since 1980. Like, this is utter brutality and
the removal of USAID, taking away things like HIV medicines to people who can live a full life with HIV, and taking away supports to children who could live full and healthy lives if they're given oxygen while they're in neonatal units and the likes of this. They estimate that could cost in the next 18 months 5 million lives.
I mean, so exactly. And so, like, then you think of our Taoiseach now, who tomorrow, or when, depending on when this goes out.
It'll be going out the day before to patrons, but you're right. Tomorrow he's sitting down. This
week, he will go and he will hand the bowl of shamrock. I mean, his narrative this week was that Trump is a particularly courteous man.
Yeah.
I mean, this is absolutely outrageous stuff. It's so shameful to have a Democratic leader sort of whitewash and greenwash one of the world's most intolerable humans, actually. One of the head of the most powerful military, but also there's so much wrong with the way he governs. And we all know this. And yet, rather than taking a stand and saying, we do stand, because they've said for a long time, we care about international law, we care about human rights. And yet the most destabilizing force in the system is Trump. He's the one who backed the Netanyahu genocide. And yet our job is to complicitly comply, bow down, hand them out the shamrock so that he can say to his Irish American supporters, so he can get the picture. And what will happen is he'll be embarrassed anyway, because Trump will embarrass him about maybe the Spanish leader. Maybe he'll say McGregor's in the next room waiting to come in. Do you want to shake his hand? I mean, he rubs our nose in it, or Martin's nose in it, not because he wants to dismantle the Irish tax haven. In fact, he wants to keep the tax haven.
Mm-hmm.
What he wants to do is undermine the liberal consensus or coherence of the European Union so he can weaken it for his own interests. That's what's going on. So, to my mind, it really shows the craven nature of the Irish elites, that if you cannot stand up to this guy, what would you stand up for? How many kids would it need, Tony? How many children should be killed before they say enough's enough?
Let me turn that question back on you before we wrap, because about 2 weeks ago, the President Connolly made a statement about what was about the nature of international law and how it needed to be upheld, and these illegal wars that were taking place, without naming Israel and the US. But we were very specific. We knew who was being discussed. She had said, while she was campaigning to become president, that the US was not a trustworthy ally anymore, and she got huge discredit. She was attacked from all sides for saying that. You can't say that. What do you mean by that? And she was like, that's borne out obviously by what we've been witnessing, and we've witnessed in the past, but more stark now than ever. But what happened is not about Micheál Martin's visit. It's about how Connolly's comments have made Micheál Martin's visit more precarious because she has said something. So it's, Micheál Martin, we can focus on him right now, but it runs a lot deeper than that. When every media outlet, every national media outlet, every national media newspaper has at least one or two columns, articles, reports talking about how this is on a knife edge because of the president saying what she's always said and been consistent throughout her long career in politics, and yet that's where we're having the debate, not about, as you just politely put it, how many dead children is enough.
Well, that's it. And I mean, the point you're making there is an important one, because I read Fionn Sheahan this morning in the Irish Independent. And again, it's this idea that what would we gain? Well, that's the wrong calculus. Like, what would we gain? Or, why would we won't make any difference? Or, he'll be in the White House, so he should invite Donald Trump anyway because he'll be there and Trump is coming to Ireland. This kind of constantly sort of, whitewashing the truth of the world in favor of narrow self-interest, and this sort of common sense that we have to always look after our own. How dare Catherine Connolly not wear the green jersey is effectively what's been said there, right? Well, I'm sorry, if you're one of the children in homelessness in Ireland, the green jersey doesn't fit you very well. If you're on the streets, if you're like, look how many people the Irish tax haven has actually let down and left behind. And so for the establishment, it's all about protecting their role as a small, important node in the wider American system. That's what it is. And let me just tell you this, right? This idea that, like, this argument, the two big arguments to try and get across is the bad apple argument. In other words, Trump is a bit of a bad apple, but, we wouldn't throw out the barrel.
We'll wait him out. We'll wait him out.
We have a long-standing relationship with America. Well, I'm sorry. It was Biden who slaughtered kids in Gaza, right? It wasn't. Biden's the nice Mayo fella who smiles and wears the nice hat and so on, but it's actually his regime that started the genocide. Obama was the president who initiated a lot of drone strikes in Pakistan, Afghanistan. I mean, they were killing people left, right, and center every week as well. He might have had the suave sophistication of being able to say the right thing, but behind all of that, he was butchering people as well. So all we want is an honest reckoning of the world we're in. And what we want is a world where people are not murdered and slaughtered over power and wealth and profits and, the use of force against ordinary people to further the interests of ruling classes. That's what I want. That's my politics. And I'm not for, bound down to anybody on the basis of narrow advantage, because in the end, that's your way into, putting the noose around your own neck so they can hang you.
Brian O'Boyle, thank you so much for your time again. As I said to listeners, if you haven't already read the article, go give it a read. And we hope to talk to Brian soon again, and maybe in a whole other realm of political thought. But I'm always fascinated by your insights on these. We don't always agree on everything, but we certainly agree on our principles. And I think that's what's really important. Listen, folks, we'll leave it there. We're going back to Gaza tomorrow to talk to someone on the ground. Yes, I'm working Paddy's Day as well. Talk to you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Tony.
Tony and Martin, Martin and Tony, speaking to interesting people only. It's the Echo Chamber podcast. Subscribe now on Patreon.